Well, hello, and thanks for joining me for today's webinar on creating rich dashboard experiences with jQuery. This is Craig Shoemaker, and if you want to follow up with me after the webinar, you can catch me at my email address or on Twitter. And if you want to get the code that I'll be using in this demonstration, you can find it at bit.ly/ig-webinar-July, which will take you to a GitHub repository that has the JavaScript code, the MVC code, everything that you'll see that I'm doing within this demonstration. So what I'd like to do is start off by showing you in context an application that we've written that uses some of our controls and uses them in a way that you might expect to see them in a business sort of context. So this is the project management dashboard, and it works as a project planner for development type of tasks. So I'd like to take you through it to get a little bit familiar with it. And then the next part of the webinar, what I'll be doing is taking a specific area of the dashboard, specifically the grid here, and working with the linear gauge and focusing on directly with that. So basically just think of this as any type of development project that you might be working on, and you have to plan the project through a certain amount of time. So you'll notice here we have worked hours versus planned hours here plotted within this grid. And then we have a number of different discipline areas. So visual design, user experience, management, development, on and on. So what each one of these rows represent is a particular person, and they're either on the visual design or the development team or on and on. And so for each week, we're able to tell, okay, well, by looking at the current week, we look at these developers, and they're starting to get a little bit over allocated. So if I look at this item here, if you'll notice by the legend over here, the gold or yellowish gold color indicates that that resource is getting over allocated. So what I can do is, since this is selected, and if you'll notice I select different date ranges, what happens is it shows the product tasks that are associated with that date range in the view area down there. So if I select a different one, you'll see it's just the task for that item. Let's go back to the current, and you'll notice that these are highlighted in that same orangish yellow color. And so when I come in here, I can see that Chris is over allocated. So we're working him too hard. We've got too much going on in this time area. So I can bring him down into a space where we have a little bit of breathing room, and then I can go ahead and accept those changes, and the project planner updates everything. And now you can see that for that time period, for that discipline area, we're now within the time range that we need. So there's a number of different actions that we can take on this. So let's say, for instance, we want to take Richard Kevinson out of the loop. You know, he won the lottery, he quit, he's on to bigger and better things. So we're going to take him out. If I go ahead and accept those changes, then you'll notice that up in the top area now, we have that updated so that it reflects the change in allocation for his hours. So basically, this whole dashboard is here in order to give a sense to someone in a business setting of having an overall view of what's going on, and a very quick way to determine why the data is meaningful to them. So we can put numbers and grids, and we can do all kinds of interesting things, but ultimately what we want to do is make the data meaningful and actionable by people who are using our applications. And one of the ways that we can do that is by showing in this grid sort of scenario of the linear gauge, to show in a very visual way of what type of hours are being allocated and overages that we're running into, and things of that nature. So what I'd like to do is just take this area right here. We're going to break this out and show you a more simplified version, and I'll show you how we can work in using the IG grid along with the IG linear gauge in order to make something like what you see here. And I'll show you how to do that not only in just straight JavaScript and jQuery and that type of approach, but also using MVC, so that no matter what type of environment, no matter what type of approach you're most comfortable with, you'll see how you can do it both ways. So as we continue here, I just want to mention, I'm just going to go ahead and go through the demo and kind of give you the prepared demonstration that I have for you, and then I'll save time for questions at the end. Please feel free, if anything comes up, to add it into the question queue, and then I can go ahead and answer that as we go along. When we go ahead and continue here, so let's bring up just the isolated demo. And this shows you the grid along with the linear gauge, much like what you saw in the dashboard, except this is using default styling and a little bit of different data. But essentially, it's basically the same thing. So what you can see is we have people listed over in the name column. And then for week 1 and week 2, we have hours information that's plotted within the linear gauge inside the IG grid. So this is basically what we're going to build using JavaScript and jQuery, and also using MVC, but it'll look pretty much the same as well. So one thing I also want you to be aware of is as you're working with these controls, it's a really good resource for you to check out igniteui.com. And so when you take a look at the grid page specifically, I guess my connection's running a little bit slow here, but when we look at the grid page, you'll be able to have access to demos for the grid as well as documentation and samples. So everything you need specific to that control you can find on igniteui.com. And so here's the page that's specific just for the grid that we'll be using. And again, you can find information about how to get started by using the code view, list to samples, API reference, and then help topics that we have available. So this is what it is for the grid, and then also one for the linear gauge. So you'll notice that the linear gauge here, this is sort of a default view for that linear gauge. It's quite a bit different than what we have within our samples. So all of the tick marks are taken off and the indicators removed. And so I'll show you how to customize it so that you can use the linear gauge for either something like this, or if you want to have something a little more plain and vanilla like we're using in this sample application. All of that is possible by using the linear gauge. Now what's nice about the linear gauge is that it's a canvas-based control. So based off of how you configure the JavaScript object that you pass into the control, it'll draw what you want based off of those settings. Okay, so let's go over to the code now. And here I'm using the Visual Studio Code Editor. It's available for free if you haven't used it yet. I really like it because it is folder based. So here I just have it pointing to the folder that has all the files for this little sample application. It makes it really easy to work with, but at the same time, you get a lot of the fun stuff that you're used to working with Visual Studio. So that's Visual Studio Code. And of course, I'm going to be building up this code as we go. But again, the full code listings are available on GitHub. So the way this application works is I have an index.html, and what I'm doing is referencing a number of different things. So I'm going out to the CDN in order to get the trial version of the CSS files that we need for Ignite UI. And so you want to add in the theme and then the structure right after that. And then we have some dependencies for Ignite UI. So the first thing that we need is jQuery, and then jQuery UI. And then also I'm bringing in the core, the Ignite UI core, and then also the line of business JavaScript file, which will give us the ability to use the IG grid, and also the data visualization file, which gives us a chance to use the linear gauge. Now, this is great for demonstration purposes, but if you're using Ignite UI in a production context, it makes a lot of sense for you to create a custom build so that you're not bringing in the code for controls that you don't need. So that's just one thing that you can consider doing. And then within this page, I have a JavaScript file just for the data, one for range calculator factory, and then logic that's specific for the grid, and then the app.js, which kind of kicks everything off. So let's take a look for a moment at the data JavaScript file. And so all this is doing is basically mocking the type of data that we would get back from, say, an AJAX request. So, if this were a real application, we'd make a call out to the server, we'd ask for some data back, and we get something that would look like this. So we have an array of objects, and so we're looking for full name, which is the names there, the unique identifier, and then the hours that they've worked for each one of the weeks. So if you remember, that maps directly to the data that we get here. So we have a row for each one of the objects, we've got the full name, and then data for each one of the weeks, which is fed into the linear gauge so that we get those ranges done that way. So this isn't really all that interesting other than the fact that we have some data available. So we'll get to the range calculator in a little bit, and then we'll also look at the grid specific logic as we work with the grid itself. But right now what I'd like to do is go into app.js and show you how we're going to kick off working with the application. Oh, and one more thing I want to mention is that you'll notice right here we have a div element which just has an ID of grid. So as we're instantiating the control in JavaScript, it's going to look for that element on the HTML page in order to basically build up the control within the page. So let's go back to app.js, and the first thing that we want to do is, like I said, instantiate the grid. So this is the jQuery ready function that's being run inside what's called an iffy, or an immediately invoked function expression. And if you're not familiar with that too much, all this does is this runs immediately as the code runs, and it provides scope. So anything that I declare within the boundaries of this function won't get polluted into global scope, and it just makes for a nice clean way to write JavaScript. So as this function is run, I'm passing in the reference to jQuery and also to window. This isn't really all that necessary. It's just a habit I've gotten into because you can write code that performs better by scoping down the variables to what's passed in there. So it just makes things clean, and it also shows you the global dependencies that you have for the code that you're running here. Basically, if any of that doesn't make sense, you don't really need to worry too much about it. Just know that we're running some code on the jQuery ready function, so as the page loads, we can start doing something interesting. And so the first interesting thing that I'd like to do is create a selector for the grid itself, and we'll do that by going to #grid. And if you remember, that was the ID for the HTML element. Now, in order to instantiate the IG grid, we'll just do that here by calling IG grid. And then in order to format it correctly and instantiate it with the correct parameters, we'll pass in an options object. And this option object gives us a chance to do a number of different things. Like the first thing that we can do is decide, okay, well, what kind of width do we want on here? And I'll just set it to 100%. Okay, and then the primary key for the data, if you recall from the JavaScript file that I showed you, was the ID. And so that's the primary key value for the data that's coming in. And then columns, we'll define that in a moment. So for right now, I'm just going to leave that as an empty object, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And the same thing with data source. So that'll just be an empty array for right now. And then we're going to auto-generate columns. Well, we're going to turn off auto-generate columns. So we'll set this to false right now. And then the last thing that we need to do is run a function for the event of rows rendered. Okay, and I'm going to add null here for a moment, and all of these dummy values will come and fill in. So let's go back to the page itself for a moment. You'll notice that we have a grid, and each one of the rows, as it's rendered, will need to instantiate an instance of the linear gauge and pass in all the values that it needs. So the data source for the grid has information about each one of these people, and so as the rows are rendered, after that's been done, then we'll go back and instantiate each one of the linear gauges and point it to the right data in order for it to set up the right ranges within the linear gauge. So for each row, we'll instantiate 2 linear gauges and go on. And that's important because that's what we'll be doing here through rows rendered. So let's go back up here to columns, and let's take a look at how we're going to set up our columns. So I have some explicit instructions of how I'd like to set up the columns, and instead of making you watch me type all that, I'll just paste this in and then we can talk about it. So here what I'm doing is create an array called column definitions, and then each one of those each one of the items in the array, has an object here that says the information that we need. And so if you were to go to the API documentation for the grid, you'd know that this is basically the properties that the column is looking for in order to set itself up. So it's looking for header text, the key, and the key would be, when we go over and look at the data, it's looking for this key within the data. So as we take a look at this column, it's going to grab the full name information by setting it equal to key. And of course, data type is just set to string. Now, that's for full name. When we go down and look for each one of the weeks, we have a specific template that we'd like to add in to the row itself. So here, by providing the template, we can add in a div, give it the class of linear gauge, and then add in a data dash value. So this is week number, and we can say this is week 1 and week 2. And so by having that information, then we can go into the data that's been provided and grab the hours information in order to update the linear gauge. So that's how the columns are defined. So once this is set up, we can just take this object And instead of having the blank object here, just put this in for column definitions. Now, data source is available. If we come back and take a look at the data, what I've done is set it up so that I have a single instance of what I'm calling an app variable. So I do have one global and everything hangs off of that. So if you go to app.data, that's where the data lives. Now, you wouldn't do this in a real world application, I know, but this is an easy way for me to make the data available to kind of simulate getting it from somewhere else. So when you do your AJAX responses and get the data back through an async request or whatever, you might go about this differently, but for right now, all I'm going to do is go to window.app.data, and that will bring in all of the data that's found in that other JavaScript file and make it available to the data source of the grid. Now, of course, we're going to set auto-generate columns to false because we've set column definitions explicitly in through that object. And so the next thing that we need to look at is running a function when the rows are rendered for the grid. Now, if you remember, I have a specific file over here, which I'm calling app.grid.js. Now, I'm putting this information into a different JavaScript file because I want to be able to share it between the jQuery JavaScript approach and also the MVC approach. So in those two different projects, you'll see the same file, and it makes it easy to share that code. But what I want to do is run a function when the rows are rendered. And here I'm calling it rendered rows, and I'll pass in the data. So the source data that the application is using, it will basically take that information and instantiate each one of the rows. But when I'm working with rows rendered right here, all I can really do is give it a function, or basically to make it clean, that's what I'll do. So I'm going to create a wrapper function here. So what I'll do is create one here and just call this rows rendered as well. And create a function here. And what it will do is call window.app grid render rows, and then pass in the data that I have available. So rows rendered will be called on the grid at this point. So as the grid renders all the rows, it will run this function, which in turn will pass the data into the function that we're about to implement. Okay, and so here we'll go up and take a look at, here it is, right here. And so I've made that function available by going again from my one global into grid and making it available through render rows. So all this is to say is that at this point, what I can do is start looping through the template and adding in the linear gauges as they've been created. So here's what it'll look like. The first thing that I want to do is create a selector for the linear gauge. And for each one of those, I have something special that I want to do. So we'll create the function stub here. And so let's take a look for a moment at the template here. So what this will do is go through and find each one of the div elements that has the linear gauge class applied to it. So that's what I'm getting a collection of at this point, and I'm looping through each one of those. So for each one of the rows, then what I can do is begin to build up the gauge itself. So now in order to kind of keep things going a little bit, I'll paste in a little bit of code and we can sort of talk about it as it goes. So here's all the variable declarations that I need here. And so the first thing is the gauge container. And so this is a reference to the div element. So by wrapping this with the jQuery selector, the gauge container is essentially taking a look at the div itself that the linear gauge will be put into. So once we have that, then we can get the week number. And if you remember, that's available by taking a look at, sorry, it's over here. Data-week number will give us week 1 or week 2. And so that's what we're getting by looking at gaugecontainer.data and asking for week number. And what we're really interested in, since we're dealing with arrays, is the index. So I'll take that week number and parse it as an integer and subtract 1 in order to give us the index. And then we also need to know the row index of the grid itself. So we'll take the gauge container, we'll look at the closest table row element that it's in. So we're looking at the table structure itself and looking for the index of that item. So now we have the row index. And then finally, what we can do is take the data that's passed in here and pass in its row index, and then we'll have the specific employee data. So by doing all of that, what we've been able to do is narrow down, instead of just looking at this full array, is to say, okay, well, if it's week 1, that will be at index 0. So now we're pulling out this data item and working with it. So once we have the employee data, then we can take a look at the hours and pass in the week index. So again, if we take a look at the data, if we have this one item, we're looking at the hours array, and then the week index will either be 0 for week 1 or an index of 1 for week 2. And at that point, then what we've got is the hours information, which is really what we're interested in order to set up the linear gauge. So now that we have that information, what we want to do is start building up ranges that will pass into the gauge. And that's the way it works, is once you instantiate the gauge, you pass it a range so it knows how to draw all the information that you're giving it. So we'll start by creating a variable. We'll stick with var. I think that's a good choice. And call this gauge ranges. And so we'll make that an empty array for right now. And next, what I'll do is just paste in some code so that we can sort of discuss what it's doing rather than worrying about the actual implementation of it. Okay, so with the gauge ranges, what we'll do is push in a new range for each one of the areas of the linear gauge that we want to work with. So the way this will happen is I have another file here, and that is the range calculator factory. Now, this is just business logic that has to deal with how we will set up the ranges within the gauge. I'm not going to talk about this. It's not really all that interesting. And if you were doing this on your own, you would certainly have a differing type of logic. But basically, all we're doing is returning a value. So for the free range, it's either 0 through 40, because that's a 40-hour work week. And all the other ranges are somewhere in between. And again, it's based off of whatever logic you might have. So this is the logic that we've implemented for this demo. Yours might be completely different. So none of that is really all that interesting, except for the fact that I'm creating that factory and then using it. So once I have that range calculator, I can take a look at the free time and get the start value and the end value and go through for each one of the different items. So here we have for worked, planned other, and overtime. So that creates the ranges and the values for each one of those ranges that we can now feed in to the linear. Okay, the linear gauge is really flexible. So it has a lot that you're able to do with it. So there's a lot of different options available to you in order to customize it. So this is me leading up to the fact that I'm going to paste in a whole bunch of code on the screen, and then we'll talk about it. Do I get a typo here? Yes, I do. So we'll fix that, and now that should line up. So what we're doing within the gauge container, and if you remember what the gauge container is that it's just a wrapped reference, a jQuery wrapped reference to that div. So each one of those divs, now we can instantiate a linear gauge in it. And so then we can just pass in an options object in here in order to define how that will look and how it will behave. So we've got height and width. Minimum value is 0, maximum value is 40. Which you saw based off of the range calculator that we worked, or that I implemented there. The actual value for the linear gauge itself will be the hours worked. And then what we'll do is pass in the ranges, the gauge ranges that we built up previously, pass that into the ranges so that it'll know how to plot that information within the linear gauge itself. So we're not putting any text on there, so the font brush, the backing brush, the outline, all that is set to transparent. And then you can pass in hexadecimal values into the range brushes so that for each one of the brushes, for the ranges that you're passing in, it has a specific color. And so that's what we have with each one of these items here. Now I set the transition duration to be 250 milliseconds so that it goes pretty quick, and depending on how you want the animation for the range, or excuse me, the gauge to work, you can play with that. But this is a value in milliseconds. Now, the label positioning we set over to a 1.5 value, and this is label extent, but really it's the positioning for the label, real easier way to think of it. And for needle breadth, well, we don't want to show a needle, so I set that to 0. And then all these other items are zeroed out as well. So all the needle parts, so all of those individual items are all set to 0 because, again, there's no needle. And if you're curious as to what I'm talking about for the needle, is this item right here. So we're not using that aspect of the linear gauge right now. So we've zeroed out each one of those options so that it doesn't show up. And then the last one is text post initial. And again, for what that's referring to is the tick marks here. So these little lines in between, we don't want those to show up at all. So what we've done is provided a value that's way beyond the range of the value of the gauge itself. So by setting this to 1,000, those don't show up at all. We've essentially turned them off. All right, so go ahead and save all the changes. Looks like I need to save this one here, and then we can launch the page and take a look and see. Just find it over here, how it runs. And there it is. So we have the IG grid and the linear gauge inside of each one of the columns of each row, plotting against the data that we have available to the application. So that's how you would do it, just using a straightforward jQuery and JavaScript approach. Next, what I'd like to do is open up the MVC application and show you how to do the very same thing using our Mvc helpers. Okay, so let's switch over to the MVC app now. And so this, again, it's basically the same thing within MVC. It's just done using the MVC paradigm. So you'll notice that the home controller here, on the index action, I'm going into the resources repository and I'm getting all the data. And so if we take a look at that, you'll see that it's getting all the employees and it's doing exactly the same thing that we had in JavaScript. So for each one of those employees, it has an ID, it has the full name. It's creating an array of the hours. Same values are being plugged in. So each one of those are being added into the hours array, and then each one of those employees is added to the employees array, and that is returned back at the end of this method. So essentially, it's the same exact information that's being provided in jQuery and just done here in the controller. And then that information, that data, is being passed on to the view. So for this approach, what I'll do is use the chaining syntax in order to work with the grid. And so when we take a look at the view itself, I need to bring in infragistics.web.mvc with this directive, and then also using dashboard.models, which if you come in here, you can see I have the employee model, the hours data, and that gets me to my resources repository as well. So what's being passed into this view, the model, the type of the model for this view is a list of employees. And so if we take a look at what's returned from getAll, you'll see that that is a list of employees. So once we have this available, now we can start working with the grid itself. So here we'll start building up the grid, and the first thing that we want to do is open up the HTML helper here, and then do Infragistics, and open close, and then we'll say that we're using the grid. Now, of course, you also have to make sure that you have a reference to the Infragistics DLL. And so here I have infragistics.web.mvc. Your licensed version will say free. This is the trial version of the DLL, which is available on GitHub. But make sure your application has reference to that. So once that's done, then what we're passing into the grid is the data, the values for this data. Now, what's happening here is that with the other approach that I showed you just in JavaScript and jQuery, maybe you had an asynchronous request back to the server once the page was already loaded, and then you're providing that to the grid. Here, remember, we're passing all the data into the view from the controller. So the HTML helper that we're using here, the Ignite UI helper, will serialize all of that data and send it as an array of JSON objects with the payload of the page itself. So on the first render of the page, it'll include all that data there. Now that's valuable because not only do you have the data available to instantiate the grid, but then you can do other things with that data once it's already in the client as well. And we'll end up doing that explicitly when working with the linear gauge. But for right now, what we want to do is take the model and we want to type that as queryable. Okay, and so what that does is that gives the data in a format that the grid is expecting. And I'm going to start formatting this a little bit nicer as well. So bring this down here and line up those little periods, and then I'll bring this down a little bit as well. So now what we want to do is basically provide the same values in the MVC helper that we did in JavaScript. So start off with the primary key, and we said that that would just be lowercase id. And then the next one is the ID itself. So what this ID refers to is the ID in HTML. So before we used a jQuery selector here, I don't need the pound sign. We'll just add in grid. So it'll be looking for the HTML element that has the ID of grid. And so that maps to that. So width will be set to 100%. And can set auto generate columns to false. And then our column definitions. We'll come back to that in just a moment. And we'll call data bind. And render. So data bind and render are required when you're using the chaining syntax of the helper, so that it knows to, again, bind the data to the control, serialize all that data, and then render it out onto the page. So we've got this squiggly here for column definitions. And so there's a number of different Lambda expressions that we can use right now in order to define the columns, and very much the same way that we did in JavaScript, we'll just do it here in C#. So what we'll want to do is call this a column. And then we get the fat arrow. And then we can create an anonymous object here. And inside that item, we can do column 4. And then inside there, we have another Lambda expression. So we'll just make this call, fat arrow, and then we'll say this is for the full name. Okay, so it knows the data that it's being bound against. So we're getting IntelliSense there. So then we can say that the header text for this item is full name. And the data type, bring this over so it matches, is string. Okay, and so we'll do this for each one of the columns that we have. So I'll just copy these two items here. So for the next item that we'll be doing is looking for our hours. Now, interestingly, if you take a look at the data as it's being built up here, is that we have the employee, which has an ID, full name, and then an array for hours. So what I'm doing within the chaining here is I'm going to set two different items. So you see here in IntelliSense, we don't have week 1 and week 2. I'm just going to do a column for hours, and this will be labeled as week 1. Data type is string. And then we also want to add to it the template. And so I'll just paste this in. And this is the same template that we had in JavaScript. So linear gauge, class name of linear gauge, and then the data-week number here. So for the next one that we'll do, we don't need to worry about the fact that there's not another hours property to go against. We can just go against hours again. We'll call this week 2. And then we have everything that we need. So that defines the columns for the grid. And then there's just one last aspect that we need in order to set up this definition correctly. And that is in order to hook into a client event that will run. So here we'll call add client event. And it's just like what we had in JavaScript. So here, this is going to be rows rendered. And what we'll tell it to do is run a function called rows rendered. Okay. And so what we'll do is add in that function up here at the top by adding in a script tag and provide an implementation for rows rendered. So here we're doing very much the same thing that we did in the other item, except what we'll do is take a look at the arguments that are being passed for the event and the UI. So the values for these arguments will be passed in by the grid itself. So what we can do in order to get access to the existing data that's been provided to the page, we'll just call this data source, and we can look at UI, which maps to this argument up here. And then what we want to do is grab the owner. So the owner at this point is the control itself. So that's the grid. So once we're looking at the grid, we can get at the data source and then call the data function in order to return the raw data. So once we run this statement here, this is the array, the actual data source array that's available in order for us to use. So then I can come in and say window, app, grid, and then render rows. And then we can pass in the data source. So this works in just the same way as it did with the other one. It will customize the grid for us. And so if we go into the scripts, take a look at app and grid, here's all the same logic that we implemented in the other item or the other project. So let's go ahead and run it and see how we do. So here it is. This is the IG grid working within the default template project for ASP.NET MVC, which includes Bootstrap, and it has the linear gauge in each one of the rows for each column for the weeks in the grid. So if we take a look at the source, you'll notice down here at the bottom is all of the script that's generated by our HTML helper. And so you notice that it's IG grid, data source, and then each one of the data items are serialized and put in through this JSON array available in the page. So that way, when this rows rendered function is run, and I take a look at UI.owner, which is the grid itself, called data source, and then the data method that returns back the raw array of this data so that I can work with it on its own. So it makes it flexible. You can work with a strongly typed environment on the server. You can provide all the information that you want to your view, and then you still have the flexibility of getting at that data and working with it later on within your page. So that's very nice. And of course, you're still available to make async requests, and you have all the different options and approaches available in either way. It's just here what I'm showing you is that you have the opportunity to do it strictly within jQuery and JavaScript, and also with ASP.NET MVC. All right, so now at this point, let's go ahead and I'll put this last slide up for you to take a look at. It has all the information there, but we can also cover any questions that you have.